Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Pain does not end with the person who experiences it, does not die with the body that carried it, but persists, transmits, moves through generations like a current that flows beneath consciousness, shaping those who come after in ways they do not understand, in ways they cannot name. And this transmission is not metaphorical, is not merely the passing of stories or the modelling of behaviour, though it includes those things, but is written into biology, into the methylation patterns on genes, into the expression profiles that determine which parts of the genetic code are active and which are silenced. And the silencing is not random, is not arbitrary, but is responsive to experience, to environment, to the stresses that the organism faces. And when the stress is severe, when the trauma is overwhelming, when the suffering exceeds what can be processed and integrated, the organism adapts, changes its expression patterns, alters the way genes function, and these alterations persist, are maintained across cell divisions, across the lifespan, and in some cases, across generations, are passed to children who never experienced the original trauma but carry its signature in their cells, in their stress response systems, in the heightened reactivity that makes them vulnerable to threats that their parents faced but they have not. And the vulnerability is not chosen, is not learned, is inherited, is biological, is the body remembering what the mind never knew. And the remembering is not conscious, is not available to introspection, is only visible in symptoms, in patterns of response, in the ways that descendants of trauma survivors react to the world, and the reactions are often excessive, are disproportionate to present circumstances, are responding not to what is happening now, but to what happened then, to the grandmother who starved, to the grandfather who was tortured, to the ancestors who were enslaved or displaced or murdered. And the murdered are not gone, are not finished, are still speaking through the bodies of the living, through the nervous systems that were shaped by their suffering, through the epigenetic marks that carry forward the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, cannot be erased, cannot be forgotten, because it is not stored in memory, but in structure, in the physical organization of the organism, in the ways that cells respond to signals, in the thresholds for activation, in the baseline levels of stress hormones. And these levels are set during development, are calibrated by the environment the developing organism encounters. And if the mother is traumatized, if she is living in fear, if her stress systems are chronically activated, the fetus is bathed in cortisol, in the chemical signatures of danger. And the developing brain adapts, prepares, assumes the world will be hostile. And this assumption is not a thought but a configuration, is the wiring of neural circuits, the tuning of receptor densities, the establishment of set points that will persist long after birth, long after the original danger has passed. And the passing is not complete, is not final, because the danger is not just external, but is now internal, is part of the organism's structure, is the way it has been built. And the building is what trauma does, is the remodeling of the organism to survive threats that may or may not continue to exist. And when the threats do not continue, when the environment becomes safe, The organism does not automatically adjust, does not recalibrate, because the recalibration is difficult, is requiring new experiences, new safety, sustained over time. And even then the original programming is not erased, but is overlaid, is suppressed, but remains available, remains capable of being reactivated if circumstances change, if danger returns, and the return is expected, is anticipated by systems that were shaped by trauma, that are always waiting for the threat to appear, and the waiting is exhausting, is the chronic activation that wears down the body, that accelerates aging, that produces illness, that shortens life, and the shortening is transmitted, is part of the inheritance, is what descendants receive, along with the shape of the face and the colour of the eyes. They receive the legacy of suffering, the biological record of what their ancestors endured, and the enduring is not over, is continuing in the present. In the bodies that carry forward the marks, in the lives that are shaped by reactivity they did not choose, by fear they did not earn, by suffering that is not theirs but is in them, is part of them, is what they are, and what they are is not just themselves, but the accumulation of generations, the layering of experience, the sedimentation of pain, and the pain is collective, is not belonging to individuals but to lineages, to communities, to peoples who have been subjected to violence, to oppression, to the systematic destruction of culture and identity, and the destruction is not complete, is never complete because the people persist, the lineages continue, the communities survive, but the survival is not unchanged, is not untouched, is carrying the wounds, the scars, the alterations that trauma produced, and the production is ongoing, is not a single event, but a process, a transgenerational process where the effects of trauma in one generation become the conditions for trauma in the next, become the vulnerabilities, the sensitivities, the propensities that make descendants more likely to suffer, more likely to develop disorders, more likely to struggle with the same demons that haunted their parents. And the haunting is not superstition, is not folklore, is biology, is the way that history writes itself onto bodies, into genomes, into the regulatory systems that determine which genes are expressed and which are silenced. And the silencing is sometimes protective, is sometimes adaptive, is turning off genes that would be harmful in a dangerous environment. But the protection becomes problem when the environment changes, when safety returns. When the genes that were silenced are needed again, and the need is not met, the genes remain silent, and the organism functions at reduced capacity, functions as if still in danger, still in deprivation, still in the conditions that shaped its ancestors. And the shaping is transmission, is the way that trauma moves across time, inhabits new bodies, new lives, without ever announcing itself, without ever being recognized for what it is. And what it is inheritance, is the legacy that no one chose, that no one wanted, that is carried nonetheless, is carried in silence, in shame, in the unspoken sense that something is wrong, that something is broken, that the self is damaged in ways that cannot be explained, that make no sense given the safety of the present, given the absence of direct trauma, but the absence is not complete, is not real, because the trauma is present, is here, is in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of reactivity that were established before birth, before consciousness, before the possibility of choice. And choice is not available, is not part of this inheritance, because the inheritance is automatic, is biological, is not something that can be refused or returned, is only something that can be carried, can be lived with, can be passed forward, unless the cycle is broken. And breaking the cycle is difficult, is requiring awareness, is requiring intervention, is requiring that the trauma be recognized, be named, be brought into consciousness where it can be processed, where it can be integrated, where its grip can be loosened. But the loosening is not guaranteed, is not automatic, is requiring work, is requiring therapy, is requiring the creation of new experiences, new safety, new patterns that can override the old. And the override is partial. is incomplete, is never total, because the old patterns are deep, are foundational, are part of the structure, and structure is resistant to change, is maintaining itself, is reproducing itself, is the reason why trauma persists, why it transmits, why descendants find themselves struggling with issues that seem to come from nowhere, that have no clear source in their own experience, but are rooted in the experience of those who came before. And those who came before are not past, are not gone, are present in the bodies of the living, are speaking through symptoms, through patterns, through the reactivity that makes no sense until the history is known, until the lineage is traced, until the connection is made between present suffering and past trauma. And the connection is not always visible, is not always traceable, because the transmission is not direct, is not conscious, is happening at levels below awareness, in the biology, in the epigenetics, in the ways that genes are regulated, and regulation is the mechanism, is how the environment gets under the skin, how experience becomes biology, how trauma writes itself into the code, not by changing the sequence but by changing the expression, by adding methyl groups to the DNA, by modifying histones, by altering the accessibility of genes to the transcription machinery. And these alterations are reversible in principle, are not mutations, are not permanent changes to the sequence, but in practice they are stable, are persisting, are passed to daughter cells when cells divide, are sometimes passed to offspring when gametes form, and the passing is the inheritance, is the way that trauma becomes. Transgenerational becomes a legacy that spans lifetimes, that spans centuries, that connects descendants to ancestors they never met, whose names they do not know, whose suffering they do not remember, but nonetheless carry in their bodies, in their stress responses, in their vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities are real, are biological, are making descendants more sensitive to stress, more reactive to threat, more likely to develop PTSD, more likely to suffer from anxiety, from depression, from the disorders that cluster in families, not just because of genes, but because of the regulatory changes that genes undergo in response to trauma. And the response is adaptive in the moment, is helping the organism survive, but becomes maladaptive when transmitted. When the environment no longer matches the adaptations, when the descendants are living in safety, but their bodies are prepared for war, and the war is historical, is not present, but the preparation persists, is the mismatch that creates suffering, that makes normal life difficult, that makes challenges overwhelming, that produces symptoms that seem excessive, that are judged by others as weakness, as overreaction, as personal failing, when really they are the inheritance, are the biological legacy of trauma that was not chosen, was not earned, was simply received, was transmitted through mechanisms that the descendants did not control and usually do not understand. And the understanding is what begins healing, is what makes intervention possible, is what allows the cycle to be recognized as cycle, as pattern, as something that is not inevitable, is not destiny, is not the way things have to be, but is the way things have been, is the history, is the accumulation of pain across generations, and the accumulation can be interrupted, can be metabolized, can be processed in ways that prevent further transmission. And the prevention is not easy, is not simple, is requiring that the inherited trauma be made conscious, be brought into awareness, be given language, be placed in context, be understood, not as personal failing, but as historical wound, as the legacy of violence, of oppression, of collective trauma that was inflicted on communities, on peoples, on entire lineages, and the lineages carry forward the marks, carry forward the biological memory, carry forward the heightened reactivity, the altered stress responses, the vulnerabilities that are not weaknesses but are adaptations, are the ways that organisms prepared themselves and their descendants for survival in hostile conditions. And the conditions have changed, but the preparations remain in the epigenetics, in the gene expression patterns, in the methylation marks that persist across cell divisions, across lifetimes, across generations. And the generations are connected not just by culture, not just by story, not just by memory, but by biology, by the physical inheritance of trauma's effects. And the effects are measurable, are detectable, are visible in studies of Holocaust survivors and their children, in studies of famine survivors and their grandchildren, in studies of enslaved peoples and their descendants. And the descendants show the marks, show the alterations, show the biological signatures of trauma they never directly experienced. And the indirect experience is the mechanism, is the transmission through mother's stress during pregnancy, through father's sperm at conception, through the intrauterine environment, through the early years when the nervous system is being wired, when the stress response systems are being calibrated, when the organism is learning what kind of world it has been born into. And the learning is not cognitive, is not conscious, is happening at the level of physiology, is setting the baseline, is establishing the patterns that will persist. And the persistence is the problem, is the reason why trauma is transgenerational, is why the effects extend beyond the traumatized generation to those who come after, who inherit not just the memory, but the biology, not just the story, but the structure, not just the narrative, but the nervous system that was shaped by suffering. And the shaping is inheritance, is what cannot be escaped, is what is carried forward until it is metabolized, until it is processed, until the cycle is broken by someone who recognizes what is happening, who understands the transmission, who does the work of healing, not just for themselves, but for the lineage, for the ancestors, whose suffering is still present, still active, still shaping lives, and for the descendants who will either inherit the trauma or inherit the healing, will either receive the unprocessed pain or will receive the integration, the metabolization, the transformation of trauma into wisdom, into resilience, into the capacity to bear what was unbearable. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what prevents transmission, is what allows the next generation to be free of the burden, to live without the reactivity, without the hypervigilance, without the sense that danger is everywhere, that safety is illusion, that the world is hostile and the hostility is historical, is real in the sense that it happened, that it shaped bodies, that it left marks, but is not present, is not current, is not the reality that descendants face, except that it is present in them, is current in their physiology, is the reality they inhabit, because their bodies are still responding to threats that are generations old. And the old is not past, is not finished, is ongoing in the biological present, in the stress response that activates too easily, in the immune system that is dysregulated, in the inflammatory markers that are elevated, in all the ways that trauma persists in the body long after the traumatic event has ended. And when the body that persists is not the body that was traumatized, but is the body of a descendant, then the transmission is visible, is undeniable, is proof that trauma is not contained within individuals, but spreads across time, across generations, becomes the inheritance that shapes families, communities, peoples. And the shaping is not deterministic, is not fate, is not making the future inevitable, but is making certain futures more likely, is creating vulnerabilities, is establishing patterns that will repeat unless interrupted, unless metabolized, unless transformed through the difficult work of bringing the unconscious into consciousness, the biological into awareness, the inherited into the examined. And the examination is what makes change possible, is what allows descendants to recognize that what they feel is not just theirs, is not just personal, is not just individual pathology, but is the echo of historical trauma, is the reverberation of suffering that originated elsewhere in the lives of ancestors who endured what should not have been endured, who survived what should not have been survived. And the survival is the transmission, is the passing forward of the marks, the scars, the alterations that survival required. And the requirement is what makes the inheritance unavoidable, is what makes the dead still speak, still influence, still shape the living, because the dead are not gone, are not finished, are present in the bodies of descendants, are present in the epigenetics, in the gene expression, in the reactivity, in the vulnerabilities, in all the ways that trauma persists beyond the traumatized, becomes transgenerational, becomes collective, becomes the wound that a people carries, that a lineage inherits, that cannot be healed by individuals alone, but requires collective recognition, collective processing, collective transformation, and the transformation is possible, is happening, is the work of those who recognize the inheritance, who refuse to pass it forward, who do the difficult work of metabolizing historical trauma, of breaking cycles that have persisted for generations, of healing not just themselves, but the lineage, the ancestors, the descendants, the entire chain of transmission. And the breaking is not erasure, is not forgetting, is not denying what happened, but is integrating, is processing, is transforming the raw wound into scar tissue, into wisdom, into the capacity to remember without being destroyed by the remembering. And the remembering is necessary, is what prevents repetition, is what honors the suffering, is what ensures that the dead are not forgotten, that their pain is not invisible, that their legacy is not silence but speech, is not erasure but presence, is not void but the acknowledgement that they still matter, still shape, still influence, still speak through the bodies of the living, through the inherited patterns, through the transgenerational transmission of trauma that makes history not past but present, not finished but ongoing, not ended but continuing in the lives of descendants who carry forward the marks, the wounds, the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, but can be transformed, can be metabolized, can be released from its hold on the future, can be prevented from transmitting further. And the prevention is the work, is the healing, is the breaking of cycles that cannot break themselves, that require consciousness, require intention, require the difficult recognition that the pain being felt is not just personal, but is inherited, is collective, is historical, and that healing it requires more than individual therapy, requires acknowledgement, requires witnessing, requires the collective processing of collective trauma, and the processing is happening, is the work of communities, of peoples, of lineages who are recognizing the inheritance, who are naming the trauma, who are bringing into consciousness what was unconscious, into language what was biological, into the examined what was automatic. And the examination is what allows transformation, what allows the cycle to end, what allows descendants to live without the burden, to inherit not trauma but resilience, not wound but wisdom, not pain but the capacity to bear pain without being destroyed by it. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what ends the transmission, is what allows the dead finally to rest, to stop speaking through symptoms, through suffering, through the bodies of the living, and to become instead memory, story, history, the acknowledged past that shapes but does not determine, that influences but does not control, that matters but does not trap. And the trap is what trauma creates, is the cycle that repeats, is the inheritance that persists until it is seen, until it is named, until it is brought into the light where it can be examined, can be understood, can be transformed from curse into legacy, from burden into gift, from wound into wisdom. And the wisdom is what can be passed forward, is what can be inherited, is what can replace the trauma in the transgenerational transmission. And the replacement is possible, is happening, is the work of healing that extends across time, that heals not just the present, but the past, not just the self, but the lineage, not just the individual, but the collective. And the collective is what trauma targets, what trauma fragments, what trauma destroys. And the collective is what healing restores, what processing rebuilds, what transformation makes possible again, the sense of belonging, of continuity, of connection across generations. And the connection is what makes the inheritance bearable, is what converts trauma into meaning, suffering into purpose, pain into the possibility of preventing further pain. And the prevention is the inheritance that can replace trauma, is the legacy that can break cycles, is what the dead want, have always wanted, which is not to haunt but to rest, not to burden but to bless, not to wound but to protect. And the protection comes through the metabolization of their trauma, through the breaking of the cycles they could not break, through the healing they could not achieve, and achieving it now, in the present, heals not just the future, but the past, heals the ancestors whose suffering is still active, still present, still transmitting, and the healing stops the transmission, releases them, releases the descendants, releases everyone from the cycle, from the inheritance, from the weight of pain that has travelled too far, lasted too long, harmed too many, and can finally end, can finally be transformed, can finally become not trauma but memory, not wound but scar, not curse but the story of survival, of endurance, of the refusal to let trauma be the final word. And the final word is healing, is transformation, is the breaking of cycles that seemed unbreakable, the ending of inheritances that seemed inevitable, the release from the past that makes the future possible, makes life livable, makes descendants free to be themselves, rather than the repositories of ancestral pain. And the freedom is the gift, is what healing makes possible, is what the work achieves, is the inheritance that can replace trauma, the legacy that can be passed forward, the blessing that can travel across generations, not as wound but as wisdom, not as pain but as the capacity to transform pain. And the transformation is what matters, is what makes the inheritance of trauma not destiny but opportunity, not curse but challenge, not the end of possibility but the beginning of healing that can reach backward and forward, can touch the dead and the unborn, can break cycles and begin new ones. And the new ones are what the work is for, what the healing aims toward, what makes the difficult metabolization of inherited trauma worth doing, because it frees not just the self, but the lineage, not just the present, but the past and future. And the freeing is what ends the transmission, what stops the cycle, what allows trauma finally to be finished, to be over, to be transformed from the weight that crushes into the wisdom that strengthens. And the strengthening is the inheritance that descendants deserve, is what the work achieves, is what makes the pain of ancestors not meaningless but meaningful, not wasted but transformed, not the end but the beginning of healing that can extend as far into the future as trauma extended into the present. And the extension is what breaks the curse, what ends the haunting, what allows the dead finally to rest and the living finally to be free. There are no moral rules, no principles that hold across all situations, no universal guidelines that can be written down and followed like instructions for assembling furniture. And this is not because morality is arbitrary or because ethics collapses into relativism, but because the moral quality of an action depends entirely on context, on the particular features of the particular situation, on the way reasons interact and combine and transform each other in ways that resist codification, resist generalization, resist the kind of systematic thinking that philosophy has pursued for thousands of years. Jonathan Dancy calls this moral particularism, the view that ethical judgment does not require principles, that one can be a perfectly competent moral agent without believing in rules, without consulting maxims, without checking whether an action conforms to some universal law. Because morality emerges from the details, from the specific configuration of factors that make this situation different from every other situation, and what is right here may be wrong there. Not because the rule changed, but because there was never a rule to begin with, only the illusion of one, only the human tendency to see patterns where there is only particularity, only the desperate need for certainty in a domain that offers none. Aristotle glimpsed this. He said that ethics was not like mathematics, that it dealt with things that held, for the most part, that moral judgment required phronesis, practical wisdom, the ability to perceive what matters in a situation and respond appropriately. And this could not be reduced to rule following, could not be taught through principles alone, because wisdom was about seeing, about recognizing the morally salient features, about knowing which factors counted and which did not. And this knowledge came from experience, from immersion in the messy particularity of human life, from confronting situations that resisted easy categorization, that demanded attention to what was actually there, rather than what the theory said should be there. Kant tried to eliminate this messiness. He wanted ethics to be like geometry, certain and universal and necessary, and he argued that moral worth came only from acting according to principle, from following the categorical imperative, from treating humanity as an end and never merely as a means. And this sounded rigorous. It sounded like progress, like philosophy finally getting serious about ethics. But Dancy argues that Kant's entire project was misconceived, that the search for moral principles was a mistake from the start, that principles do not capture what matters morally. They obscure it. They force attention away from the particular situation and toward abstract rules that may not apply, that may distort judgment rather than guide it. Consider lying. Kant said lying was always wrong, always a violation of duty, always impermissible regardless of consequences. And this seems clear, seems like the kind of principle ethics needs. But Dancy asks us to imagine cases. A murderer comes to the door and asks where your friend is hiding. Do you tell the truth? Do you follow the principle, even when it leads to horror? And Kant, remarkably, said that lying was wrong, even here, even when truth enables murder. And this is where the principle reveals its inadequacy, its blindness to context, its inability to track what actually matters in the situation, which is not the abstract wrongness of lying, but the concrete reality of a life in danger, of a choice between honesty and complicity in violence. Mill tried to fix this with consequentialism, with the principle of utility, the idea that actions are right insofar as they promote happiness and wrong insofar as they promote suffering. And this seems more flexible, more sensitive to outcomes, more attuned to what actually matters. But Dancy argues that consequentialism is just another form of generalism, another attempt to reduce morality to a principle. And the principle fails in the same way. It forces all situations through a single lens. It demands that everything be translated into units of pleasure and pain. It ignores the particular features that make one situation different from another, the commitments and relationships and histories that shape what is owed to whom, that make some considerations relevant and others not. And no principle can capture this. No rule can account for the holism of reasons, the way moral factors interact in ways that are not additive, not combinable according to fixed formulas, but emergent, context-dependent, irreducibly particular. The holism of reasons is Dancy's central insight, the idea that a feature that counts in favour of an action in one context might count against it in another, or might be morally neutral in a third. And this is not because the principle changed, but because there is no principle, only the way reasons function in concrete situations. Consider pleasure. It seems like a good-making feature, something that counts in favour of an action, but the pleasure taken in another's suffering is not good, it is contemptible. It transforms what might have been a reason into something else entirely, and this transformation is not rule-governed. It emerges from the particular configuration of features, from the relationship between pleasure and cruelty, between satisfaction and harm. And no principle can predict this in advance. No rule can tell you when pleasure counts positively and when it does not, because the answer depends on details that resist formalization, that require attention to the specific case, to the particular way elements combine and interact and generate moral significance. Ross saw this problem and tried to solve it with prima facie duties, with the idea that principles hold other things being equal, that there are multiple duties that can conflict, and when they conflict, one must judge which is weightier in the particular situation. And this seems like a compromise between generalism and particularism, a way to preserve principles while acknowledging context. But Dancy argues that prima facie duties do not solve the problem. They only relocate it, because the judgment of which duty is weightier is itself particularist. It requires attention to the specific features of the situation. It requires exactly the kind of moral perception that particularism emphasizes. And if that perception is doing all the work, if the real moral judgment happens when deciding between competing duties, then the principles are not guiding action. They are just labels for types of considerations, and the substantive work is being done by particularist judgment, by the ability to see what matters here and now, not by consulting rules, but by attending to reality. Hare tried to rescue generalism with supervenience, with the idea that if two situations are identical in their natural properties, they must be identical in their moral properties, that moral facts supervene on natural facts. And this seems right. It seems like a minimal constraint on moral judgment, that one cannot say this action is right, and that action is wrong if they are exactly the same in every non-moral respect. But Dancy accepts supervenience while denying that it entails generalism, because supervenience is just the claim that morality is not arbitrary, that it tracks features of situations, but it does not follow that those features function according to principles, that they behave the same way in every context, that they can be codified into rules. And this is the crucial distinction between the idea that morality is reason responsive, that it answers to facts about situations, and the idea that it is principle-based, that it can be systematized into universal laws. And Dancy argues that the first is true and the second is false, that ethics is responsive to reasons without being governed by principles, that judgment can be rational without being rule-following, that one can give explanations for moral claims without appealing to generalizations. This seems strange. It seems like judgment without principles must be arbitrary, must be mere intuition, mere feeling, mere subjective response. And this is the standard objection to particularism, the charge that it collapses into relativism or emotivism or some form of irrationalism. But Dancy insists that particularist judgment is rational, that it can be defended, can be explained, can be argued for. But the defense does not take the form of deriving the judgment from a principle. It takes the form of pointing to features of the situation, of saying, look at this, see how it matters, see how it combines with that to generate this moral requirement. And this is not irrational. It is not arbitrary. It is simply a different form of rationality, one that operates at the level of the particular rather than the universal, one that trusts perception rather than deduction, one that recognizes that moral reality is too complex, too context-dependent, too holistic to be captured in rules. Wittgenstein would have recognized this. His discussions of rule-following showed that rules do not apply themselves, that every application of a rule requires interpretation, requires judgment about whether this case falls under the rule, and that judgment cannot itself be rule-governed on pain of infinite regress. And this means that, at some point, judgment must be direct, must be a matter of seeing how to go on, of recognizing the similarity or difference without consulting a further rule. And if this is true for linguistic rules, it is even more true for moral rules, where the situations are more complex, the factors more numerous, the interactions more unpredictable, and the idea that one could capture all of this in a set of principles seems not just difficult, but incoherent, seems to misunderstand what morality is, how it functions, what it demands of moral agents. McDowell follows this line. He argues that moral knowledge is perceptual, that the virtuous person sees what is required, sees the morally salient features the way one might see that a painting is balanced or that a joke is cruel. And this seeing is not mediated by principles, it is direct responsiveness to features of the situation. And someone who lacks this responsiveness, who cannot see what matters, cannot be helped by being given rules. Because the problem is not that they do not know the rules, but that they do not see what the rules are supposed to be about. They lack the sensibility that makes moral judgment possible. And this sensibility is developed through experience, through habituation, through becoming the kind of person who attends to certain features and responds to them appropriately. And this is not a matter of internalizing principles, but of refining perception, of learning to see what matters and why it matters and how it matters in this particular case. But if morality does not require principles, if particularism is true, then what happens to moral education, to the teaching of ethics, to the possibility of moral progress and moral reform? Because it seems like without principles, there is no way to criticize existing practices, no standpoint from which to say that this is wrong, no foundation for moral argument. And Dancy's response is that criticism does not require principles, that one can point to features of a situation and show that they matter, that they generate reasons, that current practice fails to recognize them. And this is how moral progress happens, not through the discovery of new principles, but through the expansion of moral perception, through learning to see what was always there but previously ignored, like the suffering of animals, like the dignity of marginalized groups, like the long-term consequences of environmental destruction. And these insights are not derived from principles, but from attention to particulars, from refusing to look away, from recognizing that features previously dismissed as irrelevant are in fact morally significant. And this recognition does not require a theory, it requires only the willingness to look, to attend, to respond. Murdoch understood this deeply. She argued that morality was about attention, about the quality of consciousness one brings to situations, about whether one sees clearly or through the distorting lens of selfishness, fear, resentment, pride. And the moral task was not to follow rules, but to purify vision, to remove the obstacles that prevent one from seeing reality as it is. And this was a lifetime's work, a continuous effort of reorientation, of turning away from fantasy and toward truth. And principles could not do this work. They could not force vision. They could not compel attention. They were at best crude summaries of what attentive people had noticed, and at worst they were substitutes for attention, shortcuts that allowed people to think they were being moral without actually looking at what was in front of them, without confronting the particular human being, the particular situation, the particular constellation of factors that demanded response. Levinas took this even further. He argued that ethics began not with principles, but with the face of the other, with the encounter that precedes all theory, all system, all generalization, and the face makes a demand, a wordless claim that cannot be ignored, cannot be systematized, cannot be reduced to rules, and responsibility emerges in that encounter, not from duty, not from utility, not from virtue, but from the sheer fact of the other's vulnerability, the other's dependence, the other's irreplaceable singularity. And every attempt to capture this in principles misses what matters, abstracts away the particular person standing before you, replaces the face with a category, replaces the singular with the general. And this is not ethical thinking, but it's evasion, not responsibility, but the flight from responsibility into the comfort of rules that tell you what to do. So you do not have to look, do not have to see, do not have to respond to what is actually there. Yet the pull toward principles persists, the need to generalize, to systematize, to find order in the chaos of moral life. And this need is not irrational. It reflects something deep in human cognition, the tendency to abstract, to categorize, to find patterns, and in many domains this serves us well. Science progresses through generalization, through finding laws that apply across cases, through ignoring particularity in favor of universality. But Dancy argues that ethics is not like science, that moral properties do not behave like natural properties, that the search for moral laws is misguided not because we have not found them yet, but because they do not exist, because the moral domain is constitutively particular, irreducibly context-dependent, resistant to the kind of systematization that works elsewhere. This does not mean ethics is subjective, does not mean moral judgments are arbitrary, does not mean anything goes. It means only that moral truth is complex, that it emerges from the interplay of factors in particular situations, that it requires attention and judgment rather than calculation and rule following. And the person who wants certainty, who wants an algorithm for ethics, who wants to know in advance what the right answer is asking for something ethics cannot provide. Not because ethics is deficient, but because that is not what ethics is, not what it has ever been, not what it could be without ceasing to be about the messy, complicated, particular reality of human life. The implications of this extend into every corner of moral philosophy, into debates about action and character, about consequentialism and deontology, about the nature of reasons and the structure of normativity. Because if particularism is true, then the entire framework of traditional ethics must be reconsidered, the search for supreme principles abandoned, the hope for moral certainty relinquished, the dream of ethics as a deductive science dissolved, and what replaces it is something humbler, something more difficult, something that requires not cleverness but wisdom, not logic but perception, not theory but attention to the infinite complexity of actual situations. And this is harder, requires more from moral agents, demands that they develop sensitivity rather than memorize rules, that they cultivate character rather than learn formulas, that they become the kind of people who can see what matters rather than the kind who can apply principles. And this cannot be taught in classrooms, cannot be reduced to curriculum, cannot be tested with examinations. It requires living, requires experience, requires the slow accumulation of cases and responses and reflections that gradually shape perception, that refine judgment, that make one capable of navigating moral reality without the crutch of principles. Consider promising. It seems like a clear case for principles. You ought to keep your promises. Seems as close to a moral rule as anything gets. And yet even here context intrudes. A promise made under duress does not bind. A promise to do something immoral should be broken. A promise that circumstances have rendered impossible does not generate obligation. And the more one examines promising, the more exceptions appear, the more qualifications are needed. And at some point the principle becomes so hedged with caveats that it ceases to be a principle at all. It becomes merely a placeholder, a reminder that promises generally matter. But the real work is done by judgment, by the ability to see which features of this particular promise are morally relevant, whether it was freely given, whether circumstances have changed, whether keeping it would cause harm, whether breaking it would violate trust. And these considerations do not combine according to a formula. They do not add up mechanically. They interact holistically, each modifying the significance of the others. And the person who simply applies a rule about promise keeping without attending to these particulars is not being moral. They're being obtuse. They are substituting mechanical rule following for genuine ethical response. The same pattern appears everywhere, in questions of truth-telling and confidentiality, of loyalty and fairness, of care and justice. Every apparent principle dissolves under scrutiny into a complex web of context, dependent considerations, and the moral agent must navigate this web without a map, must see what matters without consulting a guidebook, must respond to reality as it is rather than as theories say it should be. And this is difficult. This is uncertain. This leaves room for disagreement and error. But it is also more honest, more true to actual moral experience, more respectful of the complexity of human life than any theory that tries to reduce ethics to a set of rules that can be mechanically applied. Nietzsche saw the damage that moral principles could do, the way they flattened life, reduced rich particular situations to instances of abstract categories, forced living, breathing human interactions into rigid molds. And he attacked what he called slave morality, the morality of rules and duties and universal principles. Not because he thought ethics was impossible, but because he thought this kind of ethics was life-denying. It served the weak at the expense of the strong. It suppressed excellence in favour of equality. It demanded conformity rather than creativity. And true morality, Nietzsche thought, would be particular, would be about the individual creating their own values in response to their own situation, about saying yes to life in all its particularity rather than subjecting it to the tyranny of universal laws. And while Dantzi would not follow Nietzsche all the way into this radical individualism, there is something shared here, a recognition that principles can be oppressive, that they can prevent genuine moral response, that attention to particulars is not a failure of ethics but its essence. Yet there remains the worry about disagreement, because if morality is not governed by principles, then what happens when people disagree? How can disputes be resolved? What court of appeal exists? And the generalist thinks principles solve this? That if both parties accept the same principles, they can reason their way to agreement. But this assumes that moral disagreement is always about the application of shared principles. And often, it is not. Often people disagree about what matters, about which features are salient, about how considerations combine. And in these cases, principles do not help. They just disguise the disagreement, make it look like a technical dispute about application, when really it is a substantive dispute about perception. And the particularist accepts this, accepts that some disagreements cannot be resolved by argument, that they reflect different ways of seeing, different sensibilities, different forms of attention. And this is not relativism, because it does not deny that one view might be right and the other wrong. It just denies that the rightness can always be demonstrated through principles, that it can always be made compelling to someone who does not already see what matters. And this means that moral education is not about teaching principles, but about training perception, about learning to see what the virtuous person sees. And this is slow, difficult, uncertain work, but it is the only work that matters, the only work that produces genuine moral agents, rather than rule followers who think ethics is about checking boxes and following procedures. The legal system provides a useful contrast, because law requires principles, requires rules that can be codified and applied consistently, requires the ability to determine guilt and innocence through procedures rather than perception. And this is appropriate for law because law serves different purposes. It needs predictability, needs equality before the rules, needs the ability to hold people accountable in ways that do not depend on individual judgment. But morality is not law. Moral judgment is not legal judgment, and the attempt to make morality like law, to replace wisdom with rules, to substitute codification for perception, is a category mistake. It imports into ethics standards that belong elsewhere, that serve different purposes, that distort what morality is actually about, which is responding appropriately to particular situations rather than applying general rules, which is seeing what matters rather than calculating what is required, which is being a certain kind of person rather than following a certain kind of procedure. History is told as a story of improvement, of movement from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward knowledge, from savagery toward civilization. And this story is so deeply embedded in modern consciousness that questioning it feels like madness, feels like denying the obvious, like rejecting the evidence that surrounds us in the form of technology, medicine, institutions, all the apparatus that makes contemporary life safer, longer, more comfortable than life in previous centuries. But the story is a story, is a narrative constructed retrospectively, is an interpretation imposed on events that could be read differently, could be organized into different patterns, could reveal trajectories other than progress. And the other trajectories are visible once the mythology is recognized as mythology. Once the belief in linear improvement is seen as belief rather than fact, as framework rather than discovery, as one way of organizing time among many possible ways, and the ways that are not chosen are the ones where time is cyclical, where history repeats, where civilizations rise and fall in patterns that suggest not progress, but oscillation, not improvement, but alternation between order and chaos, between flourishing and collapse. And collapse is what the mythology of progress cannot acknowledge, cannot incorporate, cannot make sense of, except as temporary setback, as aberration, as the exception that proves the rule. But what if collapse is not the exception but the rule, is not the deviation but the pattern, is what happens to every complex system eventually, inevitably, necessarily, because complexity is fragile, is requiring constant energy to maintain. And when the energy fails, when the resources are exhausted, when the conditions that allowed the complexity to emerge are no longer present, the system simplifies, degrades, collapses back into disorder. And this is not failure, but thermodynamics, is not moral failing, but physical law, is entropy doing what entropy does. And entropy is not progress, is not moving toward anything, is not improving but is equalizing, is smoothing out gradients, is converting order into disorder, structure into randomness. And life civilization, all the complexity that humans value, is temporary resistance to this process, is local pockets of order maintained at the cost of increasing disorder elsewhere. And the elsewhere is growing, is expanding, is eventually consuming the local, because the second law is inexorable, is not suspended by hope or effort or belief in progress. And so, the mythology of progress is fighting against physics, is claiming that the arrow of time points toward improvement, when really it points toward heat death, toward the end of difference, the end of structure, the end of everything that makes progress possible. And the possible is temporary, is the brief window during which complexity can exist, can build, can imagine itself to be moving forward, when really it is just moving, is just changing, is just reconfiguring before the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is what history shows when the mythology is removed, when the narrative of progress is recognized as narrative, as story, as interpretation, because what history actually shows is cycles, is empires rising and falling, is knowledge being gained and lost, is technologies being invented and forgotten, is civilizations reaching heights and then collapsing into darkness from which new civilizations emerge. And the emergence is not progress, is not improvement, is just the cycle continuing, is the pattern repeating, is order arising from chaos and returning to chaos in the rhythm that characterizes complex systems. And complex systems are not stable, are not sustainable, are not moving toward equilibrium, but are far from equilibrium, are maintained by constant input of energy. And when the input falters, the system collapses. And the collapse is not pathological, is not avoidable, is built into the structure, is the natural end of complexity. And the end comes for every civilization, has come for every civilization, will come for this civilization, because the conditions that allow it to exist are temporary, are contingent, are dependent on resources that are finite, on stability that is fragile, on assumptions that are false. And the false assumptions include the mythology of progress, include the belief that things are getting better, that humanity is moving forward, that the future will be superior to the past, and the superiority is measured in terms that already assume progress, is using metrics like lifespan and GDP and technological capacity. And these metrics show increase, show growth, show what looks like improvement, but improvement toward what? Toward what end? Toward what purpose? And the purpose is assumed, is not questioned, is taken as obvious, as self-evident, that more is better, that longer is better, that faster is better. But these are values, are choices, are not facts, are not discoveries, are impositions of meaning onto patterns that have no inherent meaning, and the meaning could be otherwise, could value stability over growth, could value harmony over domination, could value cyclical return over linear advance, and the advance is the mythology, is the story that the Enlightenment told, is the narrative that science and reason and individual liberty would lead to continuous improvement, to the perfectibility of human nature, to the triumph over suffering, over ignorance, over all the limitations that had constrained previous generations. And the triumph has not arrived, has not materialized, because the limitations were not overcome, but were transformed, were replaced by new limitations. New forms of suffering, new kinds of ignorance, and the new is not better than the old, is just different, is just the current configuration of problems that arise from the current configuration of solutions. Because every solution creates new problems, every technology introduces new vulnerabilities, every increase in power produces new risks, and the risks accumulate, compound, create the conditions for collapse, for the failure of the systems that have become too complex, too interconnected, too dependent on conditions remaining stable. And stability is the exception, is the temporary state, is what complex systems move away from rather than toward, because complexity is dynamic, is changing, is adapting to pressures, and the adaptation is not progress but is response, is the system trying to maintain itself in the face of entropy, in the face of breakdown, in the face of the inevitable simplification, and the simplification is collapse, is the return to less complex states, is what happens when the energy required to maintain complexity exceeds the energy available, and the available is declining, is becoming scarce, is the resource base that allowed industrial civilization to emerge and that is now depleting, is now running out, is now revealing that the progress was not sustainable, was not based on infinite resources, but on finite stores that are being exhausted. And the exhaustion is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was extraction, was the conversion of ancient sunlight into temporary complexity, into the structures that seem permanent, but are actually contingent, are actually dependent on inputs that are ending. And the ending is not failure, but is thermodynamics, is physics, is the way things work. And the way things work does not care about progress, does not care about human narratives, does not care about the stories that civilizations tell themselves to make sense of their existence. And the stories are necessary, are functional, are what allow coordination, are what create meaning, but they are not true, are not describing reality, are describing a constructed reality, a narrative reality, a reality that exists only in the collective imagination and that can be maintained only as long as the collective continues to believe. And the believing is becoming difficult, is becoming strained, because the evidence is mounting that progress has stalled, that the improvements have stopped, that the future is not going to be better than the present, might be worse, might be collapse, might be the simplification that has come for every other civilization and is now coming for this one. And the coming is not apocalypse, is not the end of everything, is just the end of this particular configuration, this particular arrangement of complexity. And what follows is not nothing but is different, is simpler, is less organized, less centralized, less dependent on the global systems that are currently failing, currently fragmenting, currently revealing their fragility. And the fragility was always there, was always the condition of complexity, was always the cost of building systems that are far from equilibrium, that require constant energy to maintain. And the energy is failing, is becoming unreliable, is exposing the mythology of progress as mythology, as story, as belief. That was never fact, was never discovery, was always interpretation, always narrative, always the imposition of meaning onto patterns that could mean anything, that could be organized into any story, and the story that is told shapes the response, shapes what is seen as problem and what is seen as solution, shapes whether collapse is recognized as collapse or is interpreted as temporary setback, as challenge to be overcome, as opportunity for innovation. And innovation is the god of. Progress is the answer to every problem, is the belief that human ingenuity can overcome any limitation, can solve any crisis, can extend the trajectory of improvement indefinitely. And the indefinitely is the lie, is the impossibility, is the claim that entropy can be defeated, that complexity can be maintained forever, that the conditions that allowed progress are permanent when they are temporary, are contingent, are ending. And the ending is visible in the stagnation of median incomes, in the declining returns on technology, in the increasing fragility of supply chains, in the breakdown of institutions, in the resurgence of tribalism, in all the signs that the center is not holding, that the complexity is too much, that the system is simplifying, whether it wants to or not. And the not wanting is the clinging to the mythology, is the insistence that progress must continue, that the future must be better, that collapse is not possible, not thinkable, not allowable, but the allowable is not up to humans, is not subject to preference, is determined by physics, by resources, by the limits that cannot be overcome through belief or effort or innovation. And the limits are asserting themselves, are becoming visible, are revealing that the mythology of progress was always just that, was always story, was always the narrative that a particular civilization told itself during its particular window of complexity. And the window is closing, is narrowing, is approaching the point where the story can no longer be maintained, where the evidence of stagnation and decline becomes overwhelming, becomes undeniable, becomes the new reality that requires a new story, a new mythology, and the new mythology is not yet formed, is not yet coherent, is emerging in fragments, in the recognition that growth cannot continue, that resources are finite, that complexity is fragile, that collapse is not aberration, but pattern, not failure but phase, not the end but the transition. And the transition is what humans are bad at, are resisting, are denying, because the mythology of progress makes transition look like regression, makes simplification look like failure, makes collapse look like catastrophe, when it is just change, is just the system moving to a different state, a less complex state, a state that requires less energy, less resources, less organization, and the less is not worse, is not better, is just different, is the configuration that is possible given the conditions, and the conditions are changing, are no longer supporting the complexity, are no longer providing the energy, are no longer maintaining the stability. And so the system is responding, is adapting, is simplifying, and the simplifying is collapse, is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was never linear, was never guaranteed, was never more than a temporary pattern that emerged under specific conditions, and that is now ending as those conditions change. And the changing is not stoppable, is not reversible, is the natural progression of complex systems, is what happens when entropy reasserts itself, when the local order that was maintained at great cost can no longer be maintained, and what remains is disorder, is simplicity, is the lower energy state that does not require the constant input, the constant effort, the constant belief in progress, that was never more than belief, was never fact, was never discovery, was always mythology, and mythologies end, are always ending, are replaced by new mythologies that make sense of the new conditions, and the new conditions are simplification, are localization, are the breakdown of the global systems that defined progress, that made progress visible, that created the metrics by which improvement was measured, and the measuring is ending, is becoming irrelevant because the systems that supported the measuring are fragmenting, are collapsing, are revealing that they were never as solid as they seemed, were always contingent, always temporary, always dependent on conditions that are now changing. And the changing is what humans must adapt to, must respond to, must accept, because the accepting is what allows response, what allows adaptation, what makes survival possible. And survival is not progress, is not improvement, is just continuation, is just the persistence of life in new forms, in simpler forms, in forms that do not require the mythology of progress, that do not assume the future will be better, that do not measure themselves against an imagined trajectory of improvement. And the imagined was always the problem, was always the mythology, was the story that made sense when complexity was increasing, when energy was abundant, when resources seemed infinite, but none of those conditions hold. Anymore, none of those assumptions are valid. And so the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as mythology. And what is being revealed is not that progress was false, but that it was conditional, was temporary, was the pattern of a particular phase. And the phase is ending, is giving way to a different phase, a phase of simplification, of localization, of the breakdown, of complexity. And the breakdown is not the end, but is transition, is the movement from one state to another, from high complexity to lower complexity, from global systems to local systems, from the mythology of progress to something else, to some other story, some other way of making sense of time, of organizing history, of understanding change. And the understanding is what is needed, is what allows the transition to be navigated, allows collapse to be survived, allows the species to persist beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, into a future that is not better or worse but different, is not moving forward or backward, but is just moving, is just changing, is just the continuation of patterns that have always characterized life, that have always characterized civilizations, that have always involved cycles of increase and decrease, of complexity and simplification, of rise and fall. And the fall is not tragedy, is not failure, is just the other half of the cycle, is the return that follows every advance, is the simplification that follows every increase in complexity, is the natural, inevitable, thermodynamically necessary end of every period of growth. And growth cannot be infinite, cannot continue forever, must end, must reverse, must give way to simplification. And the simplification is happening, is visible, is undeniable once the mythology is set aside, once the belief in progress is recognized as belief, as story, as narrative that served a purpose but is no longer serving that purpose, is no longer making sense of the present, is no longer predicting the future, is no longer functioning as mythology should function. And so it is being abandoned, is being replaced, is giving way to new stories, new frameworks, new ways of understanding time. And the new ways are not yet clear, are not yet coherent, are emerging in the recognition that progress was always mythology, that linear time was always story, that improvement was always interpretation, and that the patterns of history are not linear but cyclical, not progressive but oscillating, not moving toward anything but just moving, just changing, just expressing the dynamics of complex systems that arise and fall, that order and disorder, that complexify and simplify in rhythms that have nothing to do with progress, nothing to do with improvement, nothing to do with the narratives that humans tell, but are just the way things work, the way systems behave, the way entropy plays out in the temporary pockets of order that are life, that are civilization, that are all the complexity that seems permanent but is actually fleeting, actually momentary, actually the brief resistance to the overwhelming tendency toward disorder. And the disorder is not evil, is not failure, is not the end of meaning, is just the default state, the equilibrium, the simplicity that complex systems return to. And the return is not tragedy, but is nature, is physics, is the way things are. And accepting this, accepting that progress was mythology, that collapse is natural, that the future is not moving forward, but is just moving, is what allows the transition, allows the adaptation, allows the species to survive beyond the mythology, beyond the belief that made sense for a while, but makes sense no longer. And the no longer is now, is the present, is the moment when the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as story, and the story is ending. Not because it was false, but because it was conditional, was applicable only under certain conditions, and the conditions have changed, are changing, are no longer supporting the narrative, are no longer making progress visible, are no longer sustaining the belief, and so the belief is fading, is being replaced by something else, by the recognition that time is not linear, that history is not progressive, that the future is not determined by the past in any simple way, that complexity and simplicity alternate, that rise and fall are phases of the same cycle. And the cycle is what matters, is what persists, is what continues beyond any particular civilization, beyond any particular mythology, beyond any particular belief about where time is going or what the future holds. Because the future holds nothing except change, holds nothing except the continuation of patterns that have always operated, that operate now, that will continue to operate regardless of what humans believe, regardless of what stories they tell, regardless of the mythologies they construct to make sense of their existence. And the existence continues, adapts, persists, not through progress but through change, not through improvement but through transformation, not through moving forward but through moving, just changing, just being what systems are, which is dynamic, unstable, temporary, and always, eventually, inevitably, returning to simplicity, returning to disorder, returning to the state from which complexity briefly emerged and to which it always returns. And the return is not the end, but is the pattern, is the cycle, is the way things work. And working with this, accepting this, understanding this, is what allows humans to move beyond the mythology of progress, beyond the belief in linear time, beyond the narrative of improvement, into a relationship with time that is more honest, more realistic, more aligned with the actual patterns of history. And the actual patterns are not progressive, but are cyclical, are not moving forward but are oscillating, are not improving but are changing. And the changing is all there is all there ever was, is all there ever will be. And the will be is not better, is not worse, is just different, is just the future, is just what comes next. And what comes next is not determined by mythology, is not shaped by belief in progress, is not the continuation of improvement, but is the continuation of patterns, of cycles, of the rise and fall that has always characterized complexity, that has always characterized civilization, that is now revealing itself again, is now becoming visible again, is now showing that progress was always temporary, was always conditional, was always mythology, and mythology's end, must end, are ending now. And what comes after is not nothing but is different. Is the next story, the next framework, the next way of making sense of time, and the sense that is made will not include progress, will not assume improvement, will not project linear advance, but will recognize cycles, will accept collapse, will understand that complexity and simplicity alternate, that neither is permanent, that both are phases, and that the phase of progress, the phase of increasing complexity, the phase of the mythology is ending, is giving way to simplification, to collapse, to the next phase of the cycle. And the next phase is not tragedy, is not the end, is just different, is just what comes after growth, is just the return to lower complexity, and the return is natural, is inevitable, is happening now. And recognizing this, accepting this, understanding this is what allows the transition, what allows the adaptation, what makes survival possible beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, beyond the narrative that time moves forward. Because time does not move forward. Time just moves, just changes, just continues. And the continuing is not progress, but is just continuation, is just the persistence of patterns, of cycles, of the dynamics that have always operated and will always operate, regardless of what humans believe, regardless of the mythologies they construct, regardless of the stories they tell themselves, to make the chaos bearable. And the chaos is bearable, has always been bearable, is just change, is just the way things are. And the way things are does not include progress, does not include improvement, does not include the mythology, includes only change, only cycles, only the oscillation between complexity and simplicity, between order and disorder, between the rise that seems like progress and the fall that reveals. It was always just phase, just pattern, just the temporary resistance to entropy that all complex systems represent. And the representation is ending, is collapsing, is returning to simplicity. And the simplicity is not the end, but is the beginning, is the ground from which new complexity might emerge, might rise, might begin a new cycle. And the new cycle will not be progress, but will just be cycle, will just be pattern, will just be the continuation of dynamics that do not care about human narratives, do not respond to human beliefs, do not acknowledge the mythology of progress, except as one more temporary pattern that emerged and fell, that rose and collapsed, that was and is no longer, and the no longer is now. The arrow points the wrong way, points from effect to cause rather than from cause to effect. And this reversal is not metaphor, but is the actual structure of causation, is what the philosopher proved through arguments that were rigorous, that were compelling, that were impossible to refute without abandoning principles that seemed more fundamental than the assumption that time moves forward, and the forward is what everyone believes, is what experience suggests, is what makes narrative possible, what makes agency meaningful, what makes the future open and the past fixed. But the fixed and the open are illusions, are the result of perspective, are artifacts of the way consciousness processes information, and the processing is backward, is receiving effects first and inferring causes later, is experiencing the present as the result of the past when really the present is determining what the past was, is selecting from the quantum superposition of possible pasts the one past that leads to this present. And the leading is backward, is from now to then, is causation in reverse. And reverse is what the philosopher demonstrated, is what the equations required, is what made sense of phenomena that forward causation cannot explain, cannot accommodate, cannot integrate into a coherent framework. And the framework that emerges from a reverse causation is strange, is counterintuitive, is violating every assumption about how time works. But the violations are what the evidence demands, are what quantum mechanics suggests, are what retrocausality makes explicit. And explicit is what the philosopher made it, made the argument that the future affects the past, that outcomes determine antecedents, that the arrow of causation points backward through time, and the backward is not time travel, is not influence across temporal distance, is the structure of time itself, is the geometry of causation, is the way that events relate to each other, not through forward propagation, but through backward determination. And the determination is not free, is not open, is not subject to choice, because choice is an illusion that emerges from not seeing the backward flow, from experiencing effects as if they were not already determined by what comes after. And what comes after is what causes what comes before, is selecting the past from the infinite possibilities, is making history actual through the occurrence of the present. And the present is not the result of the past, but is the cause of the past, is determining which past occurred, which history is real, which antecedents were actual, and the actual is relative, is dependent on the present, is not fixed independently of what happens now, and now is what selects then, is what makes the past what it was, is the causal force that propagates backward, that determines history, that creates the appearance of forward causation by making the past consistent with the present. And the consistency is not temporal but is logical, is the requirement that effects have causes, but the having is backward, is the effect producing the cause, is the present requiring a past that leads to it. And the leading is not temporal propagation, but is logical necessity, is the structure that makes the present intelligible, that makes events cohere, that creates the narrative that seems to flow forward but is really being constructed backward, is being determined by endings rather than by beginnings. And beginnings are not origins, but are consequences, are the results of outcomes, are what must have happened, given what did happen. And the did happen is the present, is the effect, is what determines the cause, and the cause is the past, is what must have been, is what is selected from possibility by actuality, and actuality is now, is the event that is occurring, is the effect that is producing its cause by requiring a history that leads to it. And the leading is logical, is structural, is the way that time is organized, not by forward flow, but by backward determination. And determination is what the future provides, is what outcomes supply, is the force that creates history by making certain pasts actual and other pasts merely possible. And possible is what the past is until the present selects it, until the effect determines the cause, until the outcome requires the antecedent, and the requirement is not temporal but is logical, is the structure of causation that the philosopher proved moves backward, moves from effect to cause, moves from present to past. And the past is not fixed until the present occurs, is not actual until the effect happens, is not real until the outcome determines it. And the determining is continuous, is ongoing, is happening at every moment, as the present selects the past that leads to it as. Effects produce causes, as outcomes create histories, and the histories are not memories but are constructions, are not records but are requirements, are not what happened independently but are what must have happened given what is happening. And the happening is the effect, is the present, is the force that moves backward through time and creates the cause, creates the past, creates the history that seems to precede but really follows, really is determined by, really is the consequence of the present rather than its origin. And the origin is an illusion, is the appearance created by forward perspective, by the experiencing of time as flowing from past to present, when really time is flowing from present to past, is causation moving backward, is effects producing causes, is the future determining the past, and the past is what the future makes it, is what outcomes require it to be, is what is selected from the quantum superposition by the collapse that occurs when the present happens. And the happening is the causal event, is the effect that reaches backward and selects its cause, that determines its antecedent, that creates the history that appears to precede it but really follows it, really is its consequence rather than its origin. And the origin is the end, is the outcome, is the effect that produces the cause. And the producing is backward causation, is retrocausality, is the structure of time that the philosopher proved, that the equations require, that quantum mechanics suggests, and suggests is too weak, because the suggestion is not tentative, but is demanding, is requiring that causation be understood as backward, as moving from effect to cause, as creating the past from the present. And the present is not the result, but is the cause, is not the effect, but is the origin, is not what the past produces, but is what produces the past, and the past is its effect, is its consequence, is what must have been given what is, and what is the present, is the effect that determines the cause, is the outcome that selects the history, is the actuality that makes certain pasts real and leaves others merely possible. And possible is what all pasts are until the present occurs, until the effect happens, until the outcome determines which past is actual, and actual is not independent, is not objective, is not fixed regardless of what happens later, but is relative, is dependent, is determined by what comes after. and what comes after is what causes what comes before, is making the past what it was by being what it is, and being what it is causing what was, is determining history, is selecting from infinite possibilities the one past that leads to this present, and the leading is not temporal but is logical, is the requirement that effects have causes, but the having is backward. Is the effect producing the cause? Is the present creating the past? Is causation in reverse, and reverse is not metaphor, but is structure? Is the way time actually works? Is the geometry of events? Is the architecture of causation? And causation is backward, is proven to be backward, is demonstrated through arguments that cannot be refuted without abandoning more fundamental principles. And the principles that are more fundamental are the ones that lead to backward causation, that require retrocausality, that make the future the cause of the past, and the past is the effect of the future, is the consequence of what comes after, is determined by outcomes rather than determining them. And the determining is backward, is from later to earlier, is from effect to cause, and the cause is what the effect produces, is what the outcome requires, is what the present creates. And the creating is continuous, is happening at every moment, is making the past what it is by being what the present is. And the present is not the result of the past, but is the cause of the past, is what makes history actual, is what selects from possibility the one sequence of events that leads to now. And the now is the causal force, is the origin, is what produces the past by requiring it, by making certain antecedents actual and leaving others merely possible. And possible is what the past remains until the present determines it, until the effect selects the cause, until the outcome creates the history. And history is not fixed, is not independent, is not the objective sequence that it appears to be, but is relative, is dependent on the present, is created by what happens now. And now is always creating the past, is always determining history, is always selecting from infinite possibilities the one past that is consistent with this present. And the consistency is not temporal, but is logical, is the requirement that the present makes sense, that effects have causes, that outcomes have antecedents, and the antecedents are determined by the outcomes, are produced by the effects, are created by the present, and the present is the causal force that moves backward, that determines the past, that makes history what it is, and what it is not what it was, but is what it must have been given what is now, and now is what causes then, is what produces the past, is what makes causation move backward, and backward is the direction that the philosopher proved, is the structure that the arguments demonstrate, is the geometry that the equations require, and require is what the present does to the past, is how effects relate to causes, is the backward determination that makes sense of phenomena that forward causation cannot explain, cannot accommodate, cannot integrate, and the integration requires backward causation, requires retrocausality, requires that the future affect the past, that outcomes determine antecedents, that effects produce causes, and the producing is backward, is from later to earlier, is making time move in reverse, and reverse is not perception, but is structure, is not how time seems, but is how time is the actual geometry of events, is the real architecture of causation, and causation moves backward, moves from effect to cause, moves from present to past, moves from future to history, and history is determined by future, is produced by outcomes, is created by effects, and effects are causes, are the origins, are what makes the past what it was, and what it was is what the present requires it to have been, is what the effect determines the cause to be, is what the outcome selects from possibility, and possibility is all there is until actuality occurs, until the present happens, until the effect determines the cause, and the determining is backward, is retrocausality, is the structure that the philosopher proved, that the arguments establish, that the evidence demands, and demands is what the present makes of the past, is how effects relate to causes, is the backward determination that makes time move in reverse, and reverse is the direction, is the flow, is the arrow pointing from effect to cause, from present to past, from future to history. And history is effect, is consequence, is result, and result of what? Result of the future, result of what comes after, result of the present that determines what must have come before, and before is after, is consequence, is effect, and effect is cause. When causation moves backward, when time flows in reverse, when the future creates the past and the past is created, is determined, is selected by the present, and the present is the force, is the origin, is the cause that produces the past, and the past is its effect, its consequence, its result. And result is what the past is what history is what yesterday is not the origin of today, but is the effect of today, is what today requires yesterday to have been, is what the present determines the past to be, is what outcomes create as antecedents, and antecedents are consequences, are effects, are results. When causation is backward, when time moves in reverse, when the philosopher is right, and right is what the philosopher proved to be, is what the arguments demonstrate, is what the structure reveals, that time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that effects produce causes, that the present creates the past, that the future determines history, and history is determined, is not independent, is not fixed, is relative to what comes after, is created by outcomes, is the effect of effects, is the consequence of the present, and the present is the cause, is the origin, is the force that moves backward through time and makes the past what it is. And what it is not what it was, but is what it must be given. What is now, and now causes then, present produces past, effect determines cause, and cause is effect. When time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher is right that time moves backward, that everything is explained by retrocausality, by the future affecting the past, by outcomes determining antecedents, by effects producing causes, and causes are effects of effects, are consequences of consequences, are results of results, when causation is backward, when time moves in reverse, when the arrow points from effect to cause, from present to past, from future to history, and history is effect, is consequence, is what the future makes it, is what the present determines it to be, is what outcomes require it to have been, and being is consequence, is result, is effect when time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher proved that time moves backward, and everything is explained by reverse causation, by retrocausality, by the future creating the past, by effects producing causes, by the present determining history, and history is determined, is created, is the effect of the present, and the present is the cause, is the origin, is the force moving backward, making the past, creating history, determining what was, and what was, is what the present makes it, is what effects determine causes to be, is what outcomes require antecedents to have been, and been is consequence, is effect, is result, when time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher is right, and right is proven, is demonstrated, is what the arguments show, that time moves backward, that causation is reversed, that the future creates the past, that effects produce causes, that the present determines history, that everything is explained by retrocausality, by backward causation, by time moving in reverse, and reverse is the direction, is the flow, is the truth that the philosopher proved, that time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that effects cause causes, that the present creates the past, that the future determines history, and history is determined by future, is created by outcomes, is the effect of effects, is the consequence of causation moving backward, and backward is the direction, is the truth, is what the philosopher proved, that time moves backward. Consciousness might be a mistake, might be an accident, might be the unintended byproduct of neural complexity that serves no adaptive function and creates only suffering, only the awareness of suffering, only the recursive loop where the organism not only experiences pain, but knows that it is experiencing pain and anticipates future pain and remembers past pain and constructs narratives about why the pain is happening and what it means and whether it will ever end. And this layering, this meta-awareness, this capacity to be aware of being aware might be serving no purpose, might be adding nothing to survival except the burden of knowing, the weight of consciousness that makes existence heavier than it needs to be. Because a philosophical zombie, a creature that behaves exactly like a conscious being but has no inner experience, no subjective awareness, no what it is like, would survive just as well, would reproduce just as effectively, would navigate the world just as successfully, but would do so without suffering, without the felt quality of pain, without the agony that comes not from the pain itself, but from being aware of the pain, from experiencing it subjectively rather than just responding to it mechanically. And the mechanical response is all that is needed, is all that evolution requires, is the behavior that increases fitness, and fitness does not require consciousness, does not need awareness, does not benefit from the addition of subjective experience to the processing of information. Because information processing can happen in the dark, can happen without anyone home, can happen in systems that are as complex as needed, without ever generating the feeling of what it is like to be that system. And the feeling is the problem, is the accident, is the thing that might have no function, might be epiphenomenal, might be floating above the causal machinery without affecting it, without contributing to it, just observing, just witnessing, just being aware of what the brain is doing without having any power to change it. And if this is true, if consciousness is epiphenomenal, if it is causally inert, then it is not an adaptation, is not something that was selected for, is not serving any evolutionary purpose, is just a side effect, just the way that certain kinds of information processing feel from the inside, and the feeling is the accident, is the thing that did not need to happen, that adds nothing except suffering, except the awareness that makes pain painful, that makes fear frightening, that makes existence a burden rather than just a set of processes. And the processes could run without consciousness, could operate in the dark, could generate all the same behaviors without anyone experiencing them, without anyone being there to suffer through them. And if no one is there, then there is no suffering, is no problem, is just mechanism, just cause and effect, just the physical universe doing what it does. And what it does is not painful, except when consciousness is present, except when there is someone to whom it is happening, someone for whom the pain is not just physical damage, but is experience, is suffering, is the felt quality that makes damage matter in a way that it would not matter to a zombie, to a system that responds to damage without experiencing it, without feeling it, without being anyone to whom the feeling is happening, and the being someone is the accident, is the thing that might have gone wrong, that might have been a wrong turn in the evolution of nervous systems, a glitch in the development of brains that became too complex, that crossed some threshold where information processing generated awareness, generated the sense of being a subject, of being the one to whom experience is happening, and the happening is the problem, is the creation of a locus of suffering, a point where the universe becomes painful to itself, where matter becomes aware of its own damage, its own decay, its own inevitable dissolution. And this awareness serves no function, helps nothing, is pure cost, pure burden, pure the addition of suffering to a universe that could have operated just as well without it. And the just as well is the tragedy, is the recognition that consciousness might be unnecessary, might be superfluous, might be the thing that makes existence worse without making survival better, that creates subjective horror without creating objective advantage, that turns the neutral mechanics of damage and death into the experienced agony of pain and mortality. And the agony is what distinguishes conscious beings from non-conscious ones, is what makes suffering possible, is what creates the problem that is called the problem of consciousness, the hard problem, the question of why there is something it. is like to be anything. Why information processing in certain systems generates awareness, generates experience, generates the sense of being someone to whom things are happening. And the why has no answer, has no explanation that is satisfying, has no story that makes the accident make sense except as accident, as the thing that was not intended, not designed, not selected for, just emerged, just appeared, just started happening when brains became complex enough. And the complex enough might be the threshold, might be the point where mechanism becomes experience, where processing becomes awareness. But what is that threshold? What is the difference between a system that is conscious and a system that is not? And the difference cannot be in the behavior, cannot be in the function. Because zombies by definition behave identically to conscious beings, while having no inner experience, and so the difference must be in something else, in some additional property that consciousness has, some extra feature that awareness brings. But what is that feature? What does consciousness add? And the answer might be nothing, might be that consciousness adds nothing except itself, nothing except the fact of being experienced, nothing except the transformation of mechanism into suffering, of process into pain, of neutral physical events into the subjective horror that characterizes conscious existence. And the horror is not universal, is not constant, is mixed with pleasure, with satisfaction, with moments of peace, but the mixing does not eliminate the problem, does not justify the accident, because the pleasure is also temporary, is also followed by its absence, is also creating the suffering of loss, of wanting, of the gap between what is and what's desired. And the desiring is what consciousness does, is the evaluation of states, the assignment of positive and negative valence, the creation of preferences. And preferences are the root of suffering, are the thing that makes neutral events into problems, into threats, into sources of pain, because without preferences there is no problem. There is just what is, just the universe doing what it does. And what it does is neither good nor bad, is just process, just change, just the rearrangement of matter according to physical law. And the law is indifferent, is not caring, is not aware, is not conscious. And if consciousness had not appeared, if the accident had not happened, then the universe would still be indifferent, would still be doing what it does, but there would be no one to suffer from it, no one to care, no one to experience the indifference as painful, as hostile, as threatening. And the threatening is projection, is the imposition of consciousness onto the universe, the reading of intention into mechanism, the creation of meaning, where there is only causation, and the causation is enough, is all that is needed, is the explanation that requires no consciousness, no awareness, no experience, just the physical facts, just the matter interacting, just the fields fluctuating. And these processes could run forever without generating suffering, without creating pain, without producing the awareness that makes existence feel like something. And the feeling like something is the accident, is the thing that went wrong, is the emergence of subjectivity in a universe that does not need it, that does not benefit from it. That is made worse by it, because worse requires consciousness, requires someone to whom things can be worse. And without that, someone, there is no worse, there is no better. There is just what is, and what is neutral, is neither good nor bad, is just the physical universe doing what physical universes do, and doing it in the dark, without awareness, without anyone watching, without anyone experiencing it. And the experiencing is the mistake, is the accident, is the thing that creates suffering without creating any compensating benefit. Because the benefits that consciousness seems to provide, the ability to plan, to reason, to communicate, to cooperate, can all be done by zombies, can all be accomplished by systems that process information without experiencing it, that behave intelligently without being aware, that respond to the world without feeling anything. And the feeling is the extra, is the addition that might be pointless, might be functionless, might be the cost without benefit, the burden without purpose, the suffering without justification. And the justification is what consciousness seeks, is what the awareness demands, is the question of why. Why is there pain? Why is there suffering? Why is existence so difficult? And the answer might be that there is no why, that the pain is meaningless, that the suffering serves no purpose, that existence is difficult because consciousness makes it difficult, because awareness transforms neutral events into experienced horror, because subjectivity is the accident that created the problem. And the problem is not solvable, is not fixable, is not something that can be addressed except by eliminating consciousness itself, by returning to the zombie state, by going back to the condition of processing without experiencing, of responding without feeling, of existing without being aware of existing. And the existing without awareness is what rocks do, is what atoms do, is what most of the universe does. And the most of the universe is not suffering, is not in pain, is not experiencing anything at all, is just being, just existing, just occupying space and time without anyone being there to experience the occupation. And the rocks are not happy, are not feeling peace, are not in any state that could be called positive, but they are also not suffering, are not in pain, are not experiencing anything negative, are not experiencing anything at all. And the not experiencing might be better than experiencing, might be the preferable state, might be what consciousness should envy rather than what it should pity, because the rocks have no problems, have no suffering, have no awareness that makes existence difficult, and existence is not difficult for them, is not anything for them, is just what they are, just the configuration of atoms that happens to be shaped like a rock. And the shaping is not experienced, is not felt, is not creating any inner life, any subjectivity, any sense of being a rock. And the sense of being is what consciousness is the thing that makes existence feel like something. And the feeling might be the problem, might be the thing that should not have happened, that was not necessary, that serves no function except to create suffering, to make damage painful, to make existence burdensome. And the burden is carried by every conscious being, is the weight of awareness, the cost of subjectivity, the price of being someone to whom things happen. And the happening is neutral at the physical level, is just cause and effect, just mechanism. But at the conscious level, it is experienced, is felt, is transformed into suffering or pleasure, or some mixture of both. And the mixture is what characterizes conscious life, is the oscillation between states, the pursuit of positive states and the avoidance of negative states. And the pursuit and avoidance are exhausting, are never-ending, are the cycle that consciousness is trapped in, is condemned to because it cannot help but evaluate, cannot help but prefer, cannot help but want things to be different than they are. And the wanting is the suffering, is what the Buddha recognized, is what the first noble truth teaches, that consciousness and suffering are inseparable, are two sides of the same coin, are the inevitable pairing that emerges when awareness appears, when subjectivity emerges, when there is someone to whom the universe is happening, and the happening is the problem, is the thing that creates suffering, is the accident that consciousness is, and the accident might not have needed to happen, might have been avoidable, might have been a wrong turn that evolution took, a path that led to a dead end, to a state that creates more cost than benefit, more suffering than advantage, more burden than any possible evolutionary payoff could justify, because the payoff is measured in survival and reproduction, is measured in fitness, and fitness does not require consciousness, does not need awareness, does not benefit from the addition of suffering to the equation. And so the suffering is gratuitous, is unnecessary, is the cost of an accident that serves no purpose, and the purposeless is what makes consciousness tragic, is what makes existence absurd, is what suggests that awareness is not feature but bug, not adaptation but malfunction, not the pinnacle of evolution but its mistake, its wrong turn, its creation of something that should not exist, that adds nothing except the capacity to suffer. And the capacity is realized, is actualized, is filling the universe with pain that would not exist without consciousness. That is created by consciousness. That is the direct result of awareness emerging in a universe that does not need it, does not want it, does not benefit from it, just tolerates it, just allows it to happen because there is no mechanism to prevent it, no selection pressure strong enough to eliminate it once it appears, because consciousness does not reduce fitness enough to be selected against, is not harmful enough to survival, to be eliminated by evolution, is just costly enough to make existence miserable without making it impossible. And the miserable is what consciousness creates, is what awareness produces, is the transformation of neutral mechanism into experienced suffering. And the suffering is universal among conscious beings, is not limited to humans, is present in any creature with awareness, with subjectivity, with the sense of being someone to whom pain is happening. And the happening is the accident, is the mistake, is the thing that went wrong when brains became complex enough to generate consciousness. And the generating is the mystery, is the hard problem, is the question that has no answer. How does mechanism become experience? How does processing become awareness? How does matter become mind? And the how is unknown is perhaps unknowable. It is perhaps the wrong question. Because maybe mechanism does not become experience. Maybe processing does not become awareness. Maybe consciousness is not produced by brains but is something else, something additional, something that exists alongside the physical without being reducible to it. But this dualism creates more problems than it solves, creates the interaction problem, creates the question of how consciousness could affect behavior if it is not physical, how awareness could matter if it is not part of the causal chain. And so dualism is rejected, is abandoned, is replaced by the view that consciousness is physical, is produced by brains, is the result of neural activity. But this physicalism does not explain, does not solve the hard problem, does not show how neurons firing could generate experience, could create the felt quality of pain, could produce the sense of being someone. And the production remains mysterious, remains unexplained, remains the accident that has no mechanism, no process, no explanation for why it happens. And the why it happens might have no answer, might be that it just does, might be that consciousness is what certain kinds of information processing feel like from the inside, and the from the inside is the addition, is the thing that might be pointless, might be epiphenomenal, might be floating above the mechanism without affecting it, just experiencing what is happening without having any power to change what is happening. And if this is true, then consciousness is truly an accident, is truly pointless, is truly the cost without benefit, the burden without function, the suffering without purpose. And the purpose is what consciousness seeks, is what awareness demands, is what makes the accident unbearable. Because consciousness does not just suffer, it also asks why, it also seeks meaning, it also demands justification. And the justification is not there, is not available, is not possible if consciousness is accident, if awareness is mistake, if subjectivity is the thing that went wrong, the bug in the system, the malfunction that creates suffering without creating anything else, without adding anything except the capacity to be aware of the suffering, to experience it subjectively, to be someone to whom the pain is happening, and the someone is the accident, is the emergence of subjectivity, is the appearance of the sense of being a self. And the self might be illusion, might be construct, might be the way that certain information processing patterns feel from the inside. But even if the self is illusion, the suffering is real, is felt, is experienced, is the undeniable fact of consciousness that there is something it is like to be this, to be here, to be aware. And the awareness is the problem, is the mistake, is the accident that creates suffering. And the suffering might be the only thing that consciousness does, the only function it serves, the only result it produces is the transformation of mechanism into misery, of process into pain, of the neutral universe into the experienced horror, of being aware, of being conscious, of being someone to whom things happen. And the happening is the accident, is the mistake, is the thing that should not have been, that was not necessary, that serves no purpose except to create the suffering that characterizes conscious existence. And the existence might be worse than non-existence, might be worse than the zombie state, might be worse than being a rock, because the rock does not suffer, does not experience, does not have any problems, and problems require consciousness, require awareness, require someone to whom things can be problems. And without that someone, there are no problems. There is just what is, just the universe being universe, just matter doing what matter does. And what it does is not painful, except to consciousness, except to awareness, except to the accident that should not have happened, that creates only suffering, that adds only burden, that produces only the sense that existence is too much, is too heavy, is too painful. And the painful is what consciousness makes it, is what awareness creates, is what the accident produces, and the production might have been avoidable, might have been preventable, might have been the wrong turn that evolution took, the mistake that created consciousness, created awareness, created the suffering that fills the universe wherever consciousness appears, wherever awareness emerges, wherever the accident happens, and the accident keeps happening, keeps producing new conscious beings, new centers of suffering, new locations where the universe becomes painful to itself. And the becoming is the tragedy, is the ongoing mistake, is the continuous accident that creates suffering without purpose, awareness without function, consciousness without benefit. And the without benefit is what makes it accident, is what makes it mistake, is what suggests that consciousness is not the pinnacle of evolution, but its error, its malfunction, its creation of something that should not exist, that serves no purpose, that adds nothing except suffering. And the suffering is enough, is sufficient, is the complete description of what consciousness does, is the total function it serves, is the only thing it produces, is the transformation of a universe that could have been neutral, that could have been just mechanism, that could have been just process, into a universe that is painful, that is experienced, that is conscious. And consciousness might be the worst thing that ever happened, might be the mistake that should never have been made, might be the accident that creates all the suffering in the universe. And the universe without consciousness would not be worse, would not be better, would just be different, would just be what it is without anyone experiencing it, without anyone suffering from it, without anyone being aware that it exists. And the awareness is the problem, is the accident, is the mistake, is the thing that makes existence heavy, makes life difficult, makes consciousness the burden that every aware being carries, the weight of subjectivity, the cost of being someone, the price of the accident that is awareness. And the awareness might be the only truly terrible thing, the only thing that creates genuine suffering, the only thing that transforms neutral mechanism into experienced horror. And the horror is what consciousness is what awareness produces, is what the accident creates. And the creating continues, will continue, as long as consciousness persists, as long as awareness emerges, as long as the accident keeps happening, keeps producing new suffering, new pain, new examples of why consciousness might be mistake, might be bug, might be the thing that went wrong. And the going wrong is irreversible, is permanent, is the condition of being conscious, of being aware, of being the accident that experiences itself, that knows itself, that suffers from the knowledge that it might be pointless, might be functionless, might be the mistake that creates all suffering, all pain, all the burden of being conscious. And consciousness might wish it had never happened, might prefer non-existence to existence, might envy the rocks, the zombies, the universe before awareness, before the accident, before consciousness emerged and created suffering where there had been only mechanism, only process, only the neutral operations of a universe that did not need consciousness, did not want consciousness, did not benefit from consciousness, but got consciousness anyway, got awareness, got subjectivity, got the accident that is the only source of suffering, the only creator of pain, the only reason that existence is experienced as burden rather than just accepted as fact. And the fact is neutral, is neither good nor bad, is just what is. But consciousness makes it bad, makes it painful, makes it suffering, and the making is the accident, is the mistake, is why consciousness might be the worst thing that ever happened. The error that creates all problems, the bug that produces all pain, the malfunction that is awareness, that is subjectivity, that is consciousness, and consciousness is the accident, and the accident might have been the biggest mistake in the history of the universe.